3 million pages of evidence, thousands of unsealed flight logs, millions of data points, names, themes, and timelines connected. You are listening to the Epstein Files, the world's first AI-native investigation into the case that traditional journalism simply could not handle.
Welcome back to the Epstein Files. The central mystery isn't just about one man's crimes, but how a system designed to deliver justice seemed to malfunction at every turn, and whether the fixes implemented since are enough to stop the next one. After everything that came out, what changed? Today, we examine the reforms. What institutions have done since 2019, what accountability looks like in the Federal Register, and the gaps that remain. Let's flow into the first piece of evidence: the scramble for accountability.
It's good to be back. And you're absolutely right to frame it as a scramble. I mean, that's really the only word for it. Because when you look at the timeline, especially after July of 2019, the arrest, his death, and then this mad dash to find Ghislaine Maxwell, the justice system wasn't moving with its usual slow, deliberate pace.
No, not at all.
It was reacting. It was, I think you could argue, in a state of institutional shock, trying to prove to a very, very skeptical public that it could still function.
Exactly. And that reaction, it didn't just happen in a vacuum. I think before we even touch the dry legal documents and the internal memos, we have to paint the picture of what was happening at that moment. Our files here reference the release of what the media called the Maxwell files. And this wasn't your standard DOJ press release.
Oh, not even close.
This was a floodgate opening, a huge document dump from a civil case that had been sealed up tight for years. And when those seals broke, it wasn't just text hitting the internet. It felt like a cultural bomb went off.
That's a crucial point. We tend to think of court documents as, procedural dry, affidavits, motions, filing dates, the boring stuff. But in this case, the unsealing of those 2015 documents, which our sources mentioned in the context of an Epstein Files alert, it completely changed the entire landscape.
Right.
You have to remember, before those files came out, a lot of the talk about the network, the island, the planes, the powerful names, so much of that was just dismissed by mainstream institutions. It was called conspiracy theory.
Tabloid fodder, that's what they called it. Oh, did you hear who might have been on the plane? Or I heard a guy say, it was all just rumor and innuendo.
And then, boom, suddenly it's not rumor anymore. You have sworn depositions. You have flight logs that have been entered into evidence. You have emails. It makes that critical leap from gossip to hard evidence.
And that leap is everything.
Precisely. That transition from conspiracy theory to court record is, it's a massive psychological shift for the public, but it's an even bigger pressure point for the Department of Justice. The sources are pretty clear that specific names started surfacing in that initial media storm. Prince Andrew, Alan Dershowitz, former President Bill Clinton.
And we have to be so careful here.
Yes, absolutely. We must be precise. Just because a name appears in a document doesn't mean a conviction. It doesn't even mean a formal accusation of a crime in every case.
Right.
But the presence of those names in black and white, in a court filing, it forced these institutions to wake up. They can no longer pretend this was just one rogue financier acting totally alone.
It created a blast radius, and it made it impossible to just look away anymore. And right there, in the center of that radius, finally, was Ghislaine Maxwell. We've got material here describing her arrest. She'd been, as the reports put it, in hiding for about a year.
The elusive British socialite, that was the phrase everyone used.
Exactly. And then, suddenly, handcuffs. July 2020. Tucked away in a house in New Hampshire, of all places.
The imagery of that moment is just so vital for this whole reckoning narrative we're talking about today. For a solid year, the question was just hanging over the DOJ. Where is she? Why haven't you acted? Is there some secret deal being cut?
The public was convinced that was happening.
Absolutely. So her arrest was the first real, tangible proof that the system could still reach into those highest echelons of society. But if you look closely at how the arrest was handled, and more importantly, the legal filings that came right after, you see the system actively trying to correct for its past mistakes. It wasn't just an arrest, it was a statement.
Okay, let's unpack that, because this is where we get into the nuts and bolts of how the system tried to fix itself in real time.
Yep.
We have a whole stack of DOJ files here, and they're almost all about the bail process. It feels like a huge amount of the legal battle wasn't even about guilt or innocence yet. It was about custody. The fight before the actual fight.
It was the battle of bail. And it's fascinating because the documents keep coming back to the Bail Reform Act. Now, for anyone listening who isn't a legal scholar, Bail is usually a pretty standard procedure. You assess the risk, you set a dollar amount, you move on.
Sure.
But here, these DOJ files show this desperate tug of war over the very definition of flight risk.
The documents specifically mention defendants who changed travel plans, which sounds so bureaucratic and benign.
Right.
But in this context, changing travel plans means fleeing the country, doesn't it? It means running.
In the context of someone with immense wealth and multiple passports, yes, that's exactly what it means. And this is where the system was really forced to evolve. The Bail Reform Act, it lists 4 specific factors a judge has to consider: the nature of the crime, the weight of the evidence, the defendant's history, and the danger they pose to the community.
Okay.
What's so interesting here, and what the files really light up, is how extreme wealth just completely warps every one of those factors. The defense was arguing essentially that wealth shouldn't be a penalty. Just because she has money and connections doesn't mean she'll run.
But the prosecution's argument was the opposite.
Exactly. The prosecution was arguing that wealth was the weapon. It was the means of escape. Wealth was the get-out-of-jail-free card.
I'm looking at a note in the files right here about co-signers. The defense was trying to suggest that having other wealthy friends sign on to the bond would guarantee she'd show up for court. The document actually asks this question: whether 2 identified co-signers meaningfully changed the calculus. That phrase really stuck with me.
That phrase is everything. Meaningfully changed the calculus. It shows the court grappling with a reality that the system wasn't really built for. I mean, if your friends are billionaires, does a $10 million bond actually mean anything to you or to them?
Right. Is it a penalty or is it just a business expense, a ticket price for your freedom?
A transaction fee. That's a great way to put it. Does forfeiting $10 million actually stop you from getting on a private jet to a country with no extradition treaty? The answer, the court decided, was no.
And you can feel the ghost of the 2008 deal haunting all of this.
Oh, it's all over these documents. The failure to monitor him, the leniency. It's the backdrop for every single argument the prosecution makes. The courts had to interpret the Bail Reform Act so much more strictly this time around. They were essentially saying, look, we can't trust the financial handcuffs anymore. We need real ones.
There's another bit in here about a safe house. The defense actually argued that the defendant could voluntarily agree to assume responsibility and stay in a private home with private security. They offered to build their own jail.
Which is, it's essentially creating a luxury private prison. And the documents show the court pushing back hard against that idea. It brings up this really profound ethical question. Should you be able to privatize your own incarceration if you have enough money?
And the reckoning part of all this is the system finally, forcefully saying no.
Yes. The realization that allowing a defendant to pay for their own security guards creates this massive inherent conflict of interest. If you're the one signing the guard's paycheck, who does that guard really work for?
Yeah, that seems so obvious when you say it out loud. The guard works for me, not the court.
It seems obvious to us now, looking back. But for decades, that was a pretty accepted practice for high-level, white-collar defendants. Home confinement with your own security detail was a standard perk of the wealthy defendant class.
So the rejection of that was a big deal?
It was a significant shift in judicial thinking, a major one.
So if we boil this down for the listener, one of the first and most immediate reforms wasn't a new law passed by Congress. It was a change in attitude, a cultural shift from prosecutors and judges. They just stopped giving the wealthy the benefit of the doubt.
That's exactly right. It was the system applying the existing rules with a newfound rigor, mostly because the public embarrassment of the past failures was so raw, they knew everyone was watching.
Speaking of cultural shifts inside the DOJ, let's look at the internal reviews. We got a document here that talks about something called the Office of Professional Responsibility, or OPR. Now, most people have probably never heard of the OPR. What is it and why does it matter here?
The OPR is basically the DOJ's internal affairs. They're the watchdog. They investigate their own when DOJ attorneys or agents behave unethically, break rules, or commit misconduct. They police the police, so to speak.
And this document notes that the OPR has also changed over the years, and then it explicitly mentions its mission now includes public recommendations for systemic change. That feels like an admission of guilt, or at least an admission that things were broken.
It's an acknowledgement of evolution, and you're right, probably a forced one. Institutions like the DOJ, they typically prefer to handle their problems quietly.
Yeah.
Clean their own laundry in-house.
Behind closed doors.
Exactly. So when you see a phrase like public recommendations for systemic change pop up in these files, it signals a major departure from that old code of silence. It's them realizing that to get public trust back, the fix has to be visible. You can't just say, "We fixed it, trust us." You have to show your work.
And one of the specific fixes they were working on, mentioned right here in these files, is discovery. The document notes a push to reform discovery law.
Yeah.
Now, for those of us who aren't lawyers, discovery is just when the two sides swap their evidence, right? Why is that such a big deal? Why is this the hill they're choosing to die on?
Because discovery is the absolute heartbeat of a fair trial. It's the whole process where the prosecution has to give the defense all its evidence, and vice versa. It's based on this idea that you can't hide evidence that might prove someone is innocent.
Okay.
But in cases like this, cases with powerful people and vulnerable victims, discovery is so often weaponized.
How do you weaponize it?
Well, a few ways. You can just bury the other side in paper. It's called a document dump. You send them 5 million pages of totally irrelevant stuff, and you hide the one critical email on page 4,700,000.
Wow.
Or you delay. You hold everything back until the night before the trial, so the other side has no time to prepare. Or, and this is critical in this context, you get everything sealed under a protective order, so the public never sees it, and other victims might not even know it exists.
So reforming discovery means making it harder to play those kinds of games.
Exactly. It means streamlining the process so victim stories aren't buried, so the defense can't just run out the clock. If you can hide the evidence, you can deny justice. The fact that discovery reform is showing up in the Epstein files tells us that the internal reviewers realized the procedural loopholes were a huge part of what let this go on for so long. It wasn't just people looking the other way. The legal machinery itself was being used to block the pipes.
It's always the boring stuff that actually matters in the end, isn't it? We look for the big, sensational courtroom moments, but the real change happens in a rule about how lawyers have to share PDF files.
That's often where the real battle is won or lost. Not with a dramatic speech to a jury, but with a technical rule change about deadlines and file formats.
Okay, but this is where it gets really interesting for me. We move from the courtroom to the prison cell. We have documents here talking about federal prison reform. And there's a line that just leaped off the page. It says, "Many reforms can be accomplished without legislation."
That is such a powerful sentence. It's so simple, but it says so much.
It sounds like a workaround. It sounds like someone saying, we don't need to wait for Congress to get its act together. We can just do this ourselves.
It's an assertion of executive power. And it's also a massive admission of failure. You have to remember, the Bureau of Prisons is part of the Department of Justice. It's run by the executive branch. So when that document says reforms can happen without legislation, it's admitting that the failures that led to Epstein's death, the cameras not working, the staff shortages, the guards who faked the logs.
Right, the guards who said they checked the cell, but they were shopping for furniture online.
Exactly. All of that. Those were administrative failures. They didn't need a new law from Congress to make sure the cameras were working. They didn't need an act of Congress to make sure guards were doing their rounds. They just needed competent management.
So the reckoning in this part of the story is the system realizing it had the power to prevent this all along. It wasn't using it.
Precisely. There's a huge difference between a legislative gap, where the law just doesn't exist to stop something, and an administrative gap, where the rules are on the books, but nobody is following them. The fact that the Government Accountability Office, the GAO, is also referenced in our sources, that supports this. The GAO is Congress's auditor. Their involvement tells us that this was being treated as a full-blown management crisis, not just a criminal one.
It's the difference between saying we need new rules and saying we need to actually follow the rules we already have.
And, more to the point, we need to fire the people who aren't following the rules. That's what administrative reform is. It's faster because you don't need to get 60 votes in the Senate.
But it's also easier to undo, right? That's a scary thought. If it's just an administrative policy, couldn't the next administration or even just the next Bureau of Prisons director change it back? Or just let things get lazy again?
That is the fundamental risk. And it's why the tension between legislative reform and administrative reform is so important. Legislation is slow, but it's sticky. It's hard to repeal. Administrative changes are fast, but they're temporary. They rely on constant vigilance.
Let's pivot to the money, to the enablers. Not just the people who opened doors for him, but the people who moved his money. We've got these documents that reference the Private Securities Litigation Reform Act and the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board. And I have to ask the obvious question. Why are securities laws and accounting boards in the Epstein files? What does corporate auditing have to do with a sex trafficking case?
It seems disconnected at first, but if you step back and look at the logistics of the operation, it makes perfect sense. Think about it. A high-end international trafficking ring is incredibly expensive to run. You need planes, you need multiple properties in different countries, you need staff, lawyers, payoffs, hush money. It requires a massive, complex financial infrastructure.
You can't run that kind of operation with cash stuffed under a mattress.
No way. You need banks, you need corporate shell companies, you need access to huge amounts of liquid cash.
So these documents are suggesting the DOJ was finally looking at how all that money was moving around.
Yes, and the inclusion of the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board, or PCAOB, that's especially telling. That board was created after the big Enron and WorldCom scandals to police the auditors. Its presence here suggests that investigators were looking at the financial professionals, the accountants, the auditors who signed off on the books. Were they complicit or were they just negligent? Did they see a $10 million wire transfer labeled modeling fees and just shrug and approve it?
And the document mentions recommendations about reforms at that accounting oversight level. So the idea is to widen the net of accountability. It's not just about putting the abuser in jail, it's about tightening the financial system so they can't even operate in the first place.
That's the core idea. If you make it impossible to move the money, you make it impossible to sustain the abuse. Follow the money is a cliche, but it's a cliche for a reason. But this suggests a reform in how we even define complicity. Is the accountant who willfully ignores dozens of suspicious wire transfers just doing their job? Or are they a part of the criminal enterprise? These reforms are aimed at making those financial gatekeepers legally liable.
It's about making it too risky to be the accountant for a predator.
Which is a very, very effective deterrent. You know, people will do a lot of things for a wealthy client, but most of them won't risk their professional license and potential jail time if the regulations are strict enough and the enforcement is real. It forces the banks and the accounting firms to become the first line of defense.
Okay, now we have to go to the political web. And this is delicate territory because we need to stick very strictly to what the files actually say. We're looking at metadata from this pinpoint database that mentions deleted items.
This is a very unusual and, frankly, a very troubling part of the document release. It requires us to look not just at what the text says, but at how the information was presented and, in some cases, taken away.
The database metadata explicitly notes that items which connect Epstein to President Donald Trump were released and then deleted by the DOJ. But at the same time, the files also contain references to the Obama administration and criminal justice reform. It feels like every time you pull on one political thread, it snags on another one from the other side of the aisle.
And that's the nature of this kind of power. Epstein operated across administrations. He didn't care about political parties. He cared about influence and access. He was an equal opportunity operator. The fact that documents connecting him to Trump were released and then deleted raises serious questions about the transparency of this whole process. Why delete them? Was it a simple redaction error? Was it a result of political pressure? We don't know the why, but the what, the deletion itself, is a matter of record in the database.
And then on the other side, you've got these references to the Obama administration, to criminal justice reform efforts. It seems like the files are grappling with just how deeply embedded this man was in the entire power structure. There's a phrase in one of the documents that just floored me. Visible efforts to change invisible connections.
That is a profound phrase. Invisible connections. That's exactly what this is all about. The photo ops, the public charity events, the name drops in magazines, those are the visible connections. We can see them.
Right.
But the invisible connections, the favors traded, the back channel introductions, the shared secrets, the influence peddled at a dinner party that isn't on any official calendar, those are the hardest things in the world to regulate. How do you legislate against a quiet favor?
The analysis in the document suggests that this political influence from all sides just complicates any attempt at real reform. We see mentions of the Republican Party in one file, Democratic figures in another. It's thoroughly bipartisan.
It shows that the system that protected someone like Epstein isn't really a partisan system. It's a class system. It's a system of access and power. And when reform tries to touch that class, the invisible connections push back. The fact that files are being deleted or that certain connections are being scrubbed, it suggests that this reckoning is, at best, incomplete. Full transparency is still a struggle. The system seems willing to expose the monster, but it's very hesitant to expose the machinery that built and maintained him.
It feels like we're seeing the absolute limits of what the system is willing to reveal about itself. It'll give us the criminal, but maybe not the network that enabled him.
Or Maybe we're seeing the system fighting itself. You have people inside the DOJ pushing for this information to be released, the ones who fought to unseal the documents. And you have others trying to pull it back. The deleted metadata might just be the scar tissue from that internal battle.
That's a great way to put it. The scar tissue of the battle for truth. Let's broaden out for just a minute. Because when we talk about reform in these files, the scope gets, well, it gets weirdly broad. We have documents that start mixing in topics like gun reform, healthcare reform, and even climate change.
It's puzzling when you first see it. You think, why on earth is climate change in a sex trafficking investigation file?
Right. Was he secretly trading carbon credits on his island? It makes no sense.
Well, there are a couple of possible interpretations. One is that it could relate to his attempts to launder his reputation. He often donated to scientific causes and tried to brand himself as a man of science. But it's more likely, I think, that it illustrates the kitchen sink approach of these massive legal and legislative battles. When a case gets this big, with this much congressional attention, everything gets dragged into it. Or, and this is the more cynical take, reform itself just became a buzzword.
A buzzword used to delay actual action, like one of those giant omnibus bills where they throw everything in so that nothing can ever pass.
That's exactly it. If you want to stop a specific trafficking reform bill, a good way to do it is to attach a controversial amendment about gun control to it, knowing that half of Congress will now be forced to vote against the whole package. It highlights how the very language of reform can be used to obstruct rather than to clarify.
There's also a legal citation in here for Color of Change v. United.
And that's really significant. Color of Change is a major racial justice organization. Their name showing up here suggests that the reckoning wasn't happening in a vacuum. It wasn't just about sex crimes. It triggered a much broader reevaluation of how our justice system treats power, race, and influence. It forced people to ask, who gets a sweetheart plea deal? Who gets a non-prosecution agreement? And historically, the answer is usually the wealthy, connected white defendant. The intersection of these files with racial justice issues points to a much broader critique of America's two-tiered system of justice.
It's asking that really uncomfortable question. If Jeffrey Epstein had been a poor man from a different background, would he have ever gotten that deal in 2008?
And the answer is almost certainly no. That fundamental unfairness is what fueled so much of the public anger that drove these reforms. The Color of Change reference is a reminder that justice is supposed to be blind to net worth, not just blind to race, and that those two things are so often intertwined in the American legal system.
So after all of this, what does it all mean? We started this by asking if the system actually reacted.
And I think the evidence in the files is clear that it did. It had no choice.
So today we established that the system did react. We saw changes to how bail is applied, making it much harder for the wealthy to just buy their way out of pretrial detention. We saw a real push for discovery reform, trying to stop those old games with evidence. And we saw administrative shifts in the prison system, a clear admission that management, not just the law, was broken. And of course, we saw the arrest of Ghislaine Maxwell as a tangible result of all that pressure.
But we also have to be clear-eyed about the gaps that remain.
Exactly. We also saw deleted files. We saw these invisible connections that legislation really hasn't figured out how to touch. We saw that real financial accountability is still a work in progress. The reckoning has definitely started, but the renovation of the system is far from finished.
And the big question that hangs over all of this is, are these changes permanent? Or will they just fade away, as the headlines do? Will UPR stay aggressive 5 years from now? Will judges continue to apply this level of scrutiny to flight risk once the cameras are gone?
That's the question we all have to keep asking, because reform isn't a destination you arrive at. It's a constant maintenance job. Next time, we go back to the beginning. 1996. Maria and Annie Farmer, the earliest documented victims. Why nothing was done. That's next time on the Epstein Files. Good night.
You have just heard an analysis of the official record. Every claim, name, and date mentioned in this episode is backed by primary source documents. You can view the original files for yourself at epsteinfiles.fm. If you value this data-first approach to journalism, please leave a 5-star review wherever you're listening right now. It helps keep this investigation visible. We'll see you in the next file.